Welcome everyone to this, our 152nd Zoom presentation in the CHRC Zoom series that started just at the beginning of the pandemic. This is just wonderful and thank you all for coming. Today we have Dr. Meg Sears giving us her third presentation to Zoom on various topics relating to her expertise in environmental health. So her knowledge about pesticides and regulatory frameworks that are necessary to handle various chemical pollutants are the things that she is very passionate about and has spoken to us about on many occasions. It's been wonderful to hear her expertise on this. And she gained her expertise as a chemical engineer initially, and then acquired a PhD in biomedical engineering, both of which have been invaluable in her trying to marry the idea behind pollution and how this affects our health. So she has a very unique perspective on how to deal with these sorts of things, and she is currently the chair of a nonprofit organization, Prevent Cancer Now. So with that, Meg, I would like you to start your presentation on sustainable agriculture lessons from the 1930s on to inform a 2023 strategy and partnerships. Thank you very much and look forward to the speech. Thank you. Over to you, Meg.
Very good. Well, thank you so much. It's really my pleasure to be joining you today. And thank you for your kind introduction, Jean and Phil, for suggesting that I take this on. So we'll be talking about sustainable agriculture today. And this has been a topic that has had a lot of attention lately at the federal level and within the farming community, obviously. You just have to listen to the news these days. So we all eat food, the kind that comes from farms. So here in Canada, we're in a rather unusual situation because although we're a net exporter of food, what we export is commodities, but we import a lot of our prepared foods and also fruits and vegetables. So we are reliant to a certain extent internationally, but right now we do have to be concerned that some of these places that we get our fruits and vegetables from are becoming arid. You know, the Rio Grande is drying up. And so these big areas in the US that we often get our fruit and vegetables from, they are at risk. And climate is also affecting Canadian farming. Right now, there are reports of crop failures being predicted, or very poor crops, south of Lethbridge, for instance, in Alberta. We're finding that rainfall is not just kind of coming along very nicely when we need it. We'll have extreme downpours, and then we'll have periods of drought that end up with the soil being caked. And so rainfall is more extreme, and it's also less efficient. The slides will be available for you on the CHRC website, and there are active links within these. You see the first one here. So you'll be able to, go back and see more of what I'm talking about. We also have a very rapidly growing Canadian population. We're up to 40 million people. And so we have increasing demands just for more people to feed. And we have this less secure imports. So we need to diversify what we're doing nationally. And this isn't the first time that we've had to be worried about Canadian food supplies. Back in the 1920s, the prairie grasslands were started to be tilled for grain. So where we used to have a much more stable environment, suddenly it was being tilled, and it resulted in droughts within the 1930s, to dust storms, agricultural failures, both north and south of the border. And this was addressed with federal support. It was recognized at the time how important it was to restore all of the bluffs, the riparian, the strips along the streams, to keep the soil covered with vegetation And then by the 1940s, with a lot more trees and soil cover, there was recovery. But today we're seeing that this land that had been converted to natural areas is actually being transferred back to agriculture. So we're kind of going around this rather nasty circle again to some extent, and these droughts are recurring. And what was established in the 1930s was actually dismantled in 2010. That was the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Administration. So they had established a lot of expertise. And so we may want to think about eventually going back to something like that. But there is this expertise within Canada to address these kinds of situations. Now, being a farmer is tough. And this is a slide from a figure from a report that was put out by the National Farmers Union. And the top line, the black line, is farm income in Canada from the 20s up to 2016. So you can see farm income, goes up and down, but it has been steadily increasing. The green is the income of farmers. So you see we've had this vastly increased difference between what comes in the farm gate and what the farmers end up with. And that's because of the vastly increased costs of all of the inputs, the fertilizers, the pesticides, the fancy seeds, et cetera. So this has been studied and put forward quite thoroughly by the National Farmers Union. But that gap is what we have to start thinking about when we want to talk about sustainable agriculture, both in terms of the costs and also just in terms of what we're spending that money on. So this high input farming, a lot of people now are saying that we've got to change from that. It increases the risks of flood and heat and drought. It's also impacting pollination with biodiversity losses. And we have this reduced margins, and it's counterproductive sometimes, because what we're doing is removing the natural processes for fertility and carbon storage and the balances amongst diverse species. So for instance, if we spray insecticides, not only do we kill the target insect, we're also doing away with the pest of the pest, as it were. So the species that would keep our pest under control. And the way it works is that generally the pests that we are most concerned about, be they mosquitoes or something that would eat your crop, they tend to have a quicker life cycle. And then the things that eat them, be they birds or frogs or something like that, they have a much longer life cycle. So when you briefly interrupt the food supply and you may actually kill the pest of the pest, then you end up, after the pests regenerate, not having those control mechanisms in place. So we have within the organic agriculture and within research programs and so on, we're realizing that lower input organic regenerative agriculture, it works. It works at scale. If you keep the soil covered all the time, you'll have lower soil temperatures so that the soil isn't baking in these really hot temperatures. With successive crops, you can, for instance, what we're seeing here in the background is soy that is putting nitrogen into the soil and growing very well, that was planted directly into a crop of winter wheat. So the winter wheat was harvested, everything was left on the ground, and the soybeans were planted directly in there. And we have on our website descriptions of some of the farmers who are reporting great successes with this kind of thing. And on the other side, back to the costs, the increasing costs, this is some research that was done by Christy Morrissey's group, Malaj ended up having to do it was a PhD research project to put together all these graphs of the changes in agronomical chemical use in Canada. So from top to bottom, we have starting in 1991 down to 2016, the increases in, to the left, fertilizers, then insecticides in orange, fungicides and in blue, and herbicides. So this is showing us how difficult it is to get data in Canada. These kinds of graphs of figures are generated quite regularly in the US, but it was very difficult to get this data in Canada. But clearly we have seen vastly increased uses of these very expensive and high impact chemicals over time. And so with that kind of parked in the back of our mind, let's just think a little bit about what we eat in Canada. And Canada's food guide has improved quite a bit. So we're now being told to eat lots of vegetables and fruit. For protein foods, we're being encouraged to eat less meat and eggs and more pulses, that kind of thing, and to eat lots of whole grain foods. But we do have to recognize that if these foods are not organic, then with this higher consumption of pulses and grains, we're going to end up with more glyphosate, more Roundup in our food, more mycotoxins, so it's our molds from the fungal diseases, and more cadmium. And you're probably puzzled about that. Cadmium is a highly toxic metal. It's chemically similar to lead. It's a bit like lead on steroids. And the reason that we have a problem with cadmium in Canada is that it's naturally high in some places in the soils. It's naturally high in our fertilizer. And Canada has very high limits, much higher than internationally. And some of these common crops actually hyperaccumulate cadmium. So if you're eating organic food that has not had the fertilizers added along with their cadmium, then the organic food is known to have less cadmium. We have research on that. Another aspect is that glyphosate or Roundup, it will actually move the cadmium from the soil and takes the cadmium into the liquid, into the water phase, where it can be translocated to plants. Now, we don't have strict monitoring of mycotoxins and cadmium levels nearly so much in Canada as internationally. And so we've had crops actually turned around in Europe because they've been excessively contaminated. So for this presentation, a lot of the time I'm going to be spending giving you a bit of background on what you need to know in order to recognize the problems that we're having today in agriculture, and and then once you understand the problems, then the solutions are a lot more evident. And so we've had a period of time in Canada where the Pest Management Regulatory Agency, that's the part of Health Canada that deals with pesticides, back in 2021 was a landmark. It sort of opened up a period of rather interesting times when the PMRA, I'll call it, proposed that it would be okay to have more glyphosate in some of our foods. And so they proposed this, and there were a lot of people who said, no, we don't think it's a good idea to have more pesticides in our foods. And so the Health Canada said, well, if all of our farmers are going to be following the label directions, so increasing the allowable limits is not going to change what's in Canadian food, but this will just be less of a trade irritant for imports. And we say, well, not importing more contaminated food it's a good thing, isn't it? It's not just something to be treated as a trade irritant. But anyway, this conversation has been going on. And so I'm going to it's going to seem a little bit of a long time talking about glyphosate, mainly because well, for two reasons. It's the most used pesticide in the world. So it's a really good one to talk about if you're going to talk about one pesticide. And it's also in this storyline, you can see a lot of examples of problems that we're having with regulations these days. So this Roundup is glyphosate, which is this small molecule on the left, plus ingredients that are added so that it will spread well over leaves, so that it will stick, so it will penetrate into leaves. And of course, all of these adjuvants that improve spreading and sticking and penetration on foliage do exactly the same thing on your skin or in your nasal passages and in your lungs. So it's the toxicity of the product is not only what you see with the actual active ingredient. But as someone who knows a bit about chemistry, when I first saw this molecule, I said, wow, this is amazing. It looks so safe, so much safer than a lot of the chemicals we had, because it has no chlorines on it, has no fluorines, it's small, it doesn't have rings that can cause chemicals to act a bit like hormones and confuse your biochemistry. So I thought, gee whiz, what could possibly go wrong? Well, it turns out a lot. But as I mentioned, glyphosate is used a lot. In Canada, all of the pesticide sales reports that have been put out since 2007 all have glyphosate in its own top use category of more than 25 million kilograms a year. Now, that doesn't tell us how much is actually used, but one touch point was in 2016 with that research that I showed you the figure. And at that point, it was almost twice that at 49 billion kilograms a year of glyphosate being used. And just for context, the next lowest category is between 5 and 25 billion kilograms a year, or million kilograms a year, sorry. And that's for chlorine bleach. So we use a lot more glyphosate than chlorine bleach. And this is a pretty special chemical. It is not only a very broad spectrum herbicide, it kills all plants except for those that are engineered to be resistant to it, and plants that have naturally developed resistance in response to use of this herbicide. However, it was actually also patented as an antimicrobial, so it's an antibiotic. So it can affect the gut microbiome, and it affects the microbiome of the soil, which can lead to increases in fungal infections. So we have good Canadian research from a government research group showing that with the use of glyphosate, that there's more cereal diseases with fusarium. And fusarium is a highly toxic mold that is neurotoxic. It can also be a carcinogen. And glyphosate has also been patented as a chelator. And as I mentioned, chelator will wrap itself around a metal ion, takes it into the water phase, and it can translocate then into plants. So it's a pretty nifty little molecule. So with glyphosate as an antibiotic, it not only affects the microbiome of the soil, it also affects the intestinal microbiome. And this has been seen in studies in animals that were put out in 2018. There are two very recent, very powerful studies showing that that these glyphosate-based herbicides, or GBHs, at doses considered safe, are capable of modifying the gut microbiome in early development. And it in some cases can be sex dependent in these animal studies. What's happening in humans? Well, it's not ethical to feed humans pesticide just to see what happens. So we can't do that kind of research, but we can look at what's happening to do with the microbiome. If the microbiome is disturbed, the first thing that can happen is inflammatory bowel disease, and inflammatory bowel disease can lead to colorectal cancer. So we have inflammatory bowel disease increasing in children under 6 at about 7% per year in Canada. Now, this is a really horrible condition. It's a life-changing condition. These poor little kiddos can be pretty sick and hospitalized. So perhaps not completely unrelated with that trend in the young children, we are seeing colorectal cancer, which used to be a disease of older people, increasing at about 7% a year in people who are between 15 and 29 years of age. So we're looking at adolescents and young adults. So this is a pretty compelling picture that we're developing. More research has just in the last few months has indicated that this 6.7% is actually higher now. So colorectal cancer has been accelerating in adolescents and young adults. And it's also important to know that the Pest Management Regulatory Agency had in their confidential test data, the industry submitted their regulatory studies, and they actually noted that there was anal staining and soiled cage mats within their animal studies. And those are indications of intestinal distress as well. But in their analysis, the PMRA said that this was not adverse. Now, I'm not sure if you asked the parents of these young children or the parents of these adolescents and young adults about how adverse their, the related effects are. But that's, that gives you an idea of the background of the regulatory history here. So this is worth going back and looking at again. Or we could simply cut back on the amount of glyphosate. Glyphosate has also been linked to spontaneous abortion, early birth, and infertility. In the top study here was also done by Health Canada by Ty Arbuckle, who is a remarkable researcher who retired just a couple of years ago, I think it was. So we've seen late abortion associated with preconception glyphosate exposure in Canadians. In a much more recent study from 2018, 90% of pregnant women had detectable glyphosate in their urine, and those with higher levels were more likely to have a shorter pregnancy. And then in the animal studies, glyphosate also interferes with implantation, and there's a mechanism understood now that it's via estrogen receptor. So we've got a lot of evidence on this reproductive problems as well. And then, of course, can glyphosate cause cancer? Because we've heard a lot about that. And back in 2015, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is associated with the World Health Organization, said probably yes. And then Health Canada and all the other regulators around the world and the pesticide industry all came out with a very loud chorus of probably not. And the reason that they gave was that IARC was irrelevant because they, according to Health Canada and so many others, they said that exposure was not considered. And this is hard to understand because the International Agency for Research on Cancer, or IARC, actually considered Canadian real-life epidemiology. So if this is happening in real life, then these people are exposed and it's a real-life exposure. So how can you say that exposure was not being considered? That's not logical. So we have from the same group, back in 2001, they found that there was a dose-response relationship between glyphosate exposure and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And in these studies, when you find a dose-response relationship, that means that the study is a lot stronger. So back in 2001, we already had pretty strong evidence. In 2021 or 2023, these exposures are so ubiquitous now that it would be really hard to replicate this kind of research. But nevertheless, the science does keep coming. So there are genotoxicity assays. There was a big review of those that was very recently published. And the researchers said the conclusion that glyphosate-based herbicides pose no risk of cancer via genotoxic mechanism is untenable. They came out very strongly against that conclusion. And in a second study, looking at the agricultural health study, this is the largest epidemiology study in the US. They also found in human farmers that the association between glyphosate exposure and oxidative stress, and oxidative stress is a general stress, but it's associated with the formation of cancers and other adverse effects, that these people who were more exposed to glyphosate had higher levels of oxidative stress, and the researchers found that this should be considered when you're looking at the potential for glyphosate to cause cancer. So that's some of the glyphosate science. Now, if we're going to kind of connect the dots, what is actually happening with cancer in Canadians? And so these are graphs that are put out by the Canadian Cancer Society and StatsCan. This work was last done in 2017. And what they're doing is they're looking at males and females and talking about which kinds of cancers are increasing and which kinds are decreasing, which is great. And so this study, first of all, it says very clearly it is quite possible to prevent cancer because tobacco-associated cancers are going down. But there's a series of cancers that are going up, and these are related to toxic exposures. If there's a trend, if there's a change, then it's because something is changing. You know, we don't just have spontaneous changes for no reason whatsoever in our population epidemiology and the diseases in the population. So sure enough, this non-Hodgkin's lymphoma crops up again as a rapidly increasing type of cancer in Canadians. And not only that, in the court of law, the evidence there has also found that glyphosate causes non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And this was done in California. There is a good film on it out now. People can stream on GEM or probably lots of other platforms. And in California, there are fewer risks and larger possible benefits from these kinds of toxic torts, as they're called. So this was instigated in California, and then after 3 very large lawsuits that were won very, very thoroughly, Bayer is now paying out $10.9 billion to settle more than 100,000 lawsuits in the US. There is also a new report that was put out by a non-regulatory agency in the US. It's the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry. And they show that glyphosate causes non-Hodgkin's lymphoma as well. But what was really interesting is that there is a very strong piece of scientific falsification. When people hear about this, and it's kind of subtle, it's very detailed, but I really want you to just get some kind of idea of what is, what's kind of behind the curtain in terms of the science. So when the ATSDR put out their draft, they, just for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, they gathered together all the various studies, and there are single studies, but then researchers also sort of slice and dice the existing evidence and then pull together all of the studies. So these meta-analyses, and they conclude whether or not a certain exposure causes a disease. So what we're looking at is for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma from the ATSDR. And in the draft, there were 3 meta-analyses, and all were clearly significantly positive. So everything, the point estimate and the bar was all to the right of 1. And that means that it's higher odds than, it's higher odds than 1 that this exposure causes non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And then when this came out, there was a bit of a cottage industry to make sure there were lots more meta-analyses. So the first 3 were included in the final, but then there were 3 more. But there's 2 notable things in this final one. First of all, that one with the big blue arrow next to it is correctly depicted in the draft, but then it was changed to be insignificant in the final. Now, I've worked on some of these, and you go through and you do your data extraction, and you don't go back and redo the data extraction. So this is a falsification. This is not, somebody making some mistake. Oops, it was a bad day. This is a change of existing data that was there for the draft. And the other thing is that now instead of 3, there are 6 meta-analyses. There's one in the middle there by Leon et al. That shows with high degree of significance that there's no causality whatsoever, and that was put together by a group of industries. And then there were 2 other independent meta-analyses that again show highly significant correlation between non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and the glyphosate. So I hope that was understandable, but this is the kind of thing that's behind the scenes when people are talking about whether or not a particular exposure causes a cancer. So with that scientific background, we'll get back to our story in Canada. So Health Canada said, okay, we should be able to increase these maximum residue limits, or MRLs. And so a lot of groups, including Safe Food Matters and Prevent Cancer Now, objected. And there's various ways of objecting, but we also looked at the confidential test data, the data that Health Canada is using. And this is another way that data somehow gets morphed into something that is really not very accurate. So these MRLs are based on field trials, and this data is sparse, it's scattered, and it's very site-specific. But as I mentioned, this glyphosate accumulates in the seeds as they ripen. So there's 2 kinds of crops that we were looking at specifically, beans and peas. And both of these can grow either as a determinate plant. So it's a one and done, you get your bush, all the pods form, they all ripen at the same time, and then the plant dies. So, but then you can also have like Jack and the Beanstalk beans, where it just keeps growing and growing and growing. There's always more flowers, there's more beans until the frost kills it. So the problem is that if you spray glyphosate on an immature pod, then you're more likely to get higher accumulation. So first of all, these groups of peas or beans included both the determinate and indeterminate varieties, and they're regulated just based on one of these. So the pesticide regulators make this completely invalid assumption that glyphosate levels will decrease over time. And so when we looked at the this data, we pulled it together and graphed it. And these are the results of the so-called decline studies. And I see no evidence whatsoever, either for the beans on the left or for these two trials of peas on the right, of any decline whatsoever. And in fact, to the left, there was a correlation that they were actually inclining. Looks as if perhaps the field trial to the right was a bit of an incline as well. And so these proposed MRLs that are based upon this field trial data are really not based on anything that's very substantive at all. And very recently, there's a publication that peer-reviewed publication that was put together principally by some researchers, Marie-Hélène Bacon and her colleagues in Quebec. And the name of this paper is Poisoning Regulation, Research, Health, and the Environment. So they go into great detail on the glyphosate-based herbicides case in the States, and criticizing the regulatory process and making very strong claims regarding regulatory capture. So that's a bit about glyphosate. So glyphosate is becoming less and less useful because we have glyphosate resistance. And I'll just note briefly that there are a lot more products that are coming along. You know, it would be a shame to waste a great opportunity. If one product is no longer good, then you've got to have something else. So this is one of the molecules. You'll see that this molecule is a lot more complicated than glyphosate. It's also got the fluorine atoms on it and the chlorine, which make it more potent and more persistent. It also has these ring structures, which sometimes can signal that there's going to be interference with signaling, like hormone actions. So this brand new tiafenicil, we objected to, and there's a link there. You can have a look at that. And I got the data, and just yesterday, in fact, there is a proposal out by the PMRA because there was one very large study in this. And although I was supposed to be able to inspect the confidential test data, that was impossible the way it was presented. And so I'd asked the PMRA about that. And yesterday they announced that they plan to change the regulations so that reanalysis of this data will be possible. I would just also note that along with all the other concerns with tiafenicil, you'll see up at the top there there's that piece with the 3 Fs on it, 3 fluorines. So when that breaks down, this part of it actually goes up and it interferes with the ozone layer. So if you're looking for toxic effects, this seems to be a pretty all-purpose chemical to do all sorts of potentially not so good things. But it's very good at killing plants. So in order to address these kinds of problems, we really do need better pesticides oversight. And at the present time, this really exceeds the PMRA's scientific capabilities. It's not feasible even. The quantities and the numbers of chemicals that are on the market that are being registered, and the slowness, it's a delay of, couldn't be 5 or 10 years between the time that concerns are recognized and something is off the market. So we have too many variables. We have too little data. We don't have the exposure data. to actually do a proper analysis to be keeping track of the effects of these chemicals on people, let alone on the biodiversity. So we would need a lot more money, we would need the expertise, and we would need the political will for baseline, for monitoring. We have never measured glyphosate in humans in Canada. It's our most used pesticide. We've measured other pesticides, but we have never measured glyphosate. And for several rounds of the Canadian Health Measures Survey, we've been told, oh, they'll do it in the next one. And the next one seems to have a changing number. So we're still, being promised that the next one will include glyphosate. We need to have the scientific capabilities for regular systematic literature searching, the data extraction, updating of the scientific syntheses. We actually need proper sales and use data. We don't even have that. And then we need the scientific infrastructure to be able to link exposures to health. And we need transparency so that we have access to the data for independent researchers. And we're missing all of these. So basically, we're flying blind. However, before the 2021 election, and there was this hoo-for-all about the possibility of increasing glyphosate. It was a political issue. And so they, the government, before the election, promised to transform our pesticide regulation. And it was very aspirational, and they said lots of good things. They promised increased transparency, but in fact, we waited months to receive the consultation document for tiafenicil, the chemical I mentioned earlier, and we received it the day after the consultation period ended, which was not very helpful. We are also in court regarding a very old World War II chemistry type insecticide, and that was just dragged out and out and dragged on and on. So what we think is that the Pest Management Regulatory Agency should actually do what its name says, and it should focus on pests rather than pesticides. And this will require a fundamental rethink of what exactly they are supposed to be doing. But right now, they're a chemical management regulatory agency. And part of the problem is regulatory capture, just as Becon et al. Mentioned in their paper, as part of this proportional, it was part of the transparency and transformation of the PMRA, there was a proportional effort consultation going on. And the idea is that if they're going to put a lot of effort into science and so on, then they should be allocating resources where they're going to have the greatest effect in terms of protection of public and environmental health. So the Health Canada hired Deloitte, a consulting company. And so in 2022, they consulted stakeholders and they proposed this framework so that the PMRA could reduce its huge backlog. I participated in that, as did many of my colleagues in various organizations. And then when we got the What We Heard report, it really didn't reflect what we had said. Now, Deloitte is a very large international company. It has many federal contracts. It received about $1.5 billion worth of federal contracts during those 5 years. So unfortunately, Deloitte works for the pesticide industry. Perhaps that's why we were not very satisfied with what they had said. And they don't make it, they're not trying to hide that. It's just that that's who they work for. In Europe, they put out a big report for the crop life, which has this little logo down on the bottom right-hand corner there, on the sustainable use of pesticides and integrated pest management. So they're not talking about, sustainable pest control. This is use of pesticides. And again, in Australia, they also put out reports encouraging the continued use of more and more pesticides as being the only solution to pests. CropLife is also collaborating with the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization to encourage, basically use of pesticides all over the place. They are collaborating for the sound management of pesticides, but there's no Food and Agriculture Organization collaboration with the organic sector. And now recently, the government enacted a CropLife gene-edited seeds recommendation. I was on the call for for all of the reporters and so on as part of their announcement of this decision. And within a minute, CropLife basically thanked the minister for enacting their recommendation. So there was no they were not trying to hide that at all. And the idea is that we have genetically modified plants, but now we're going to have genetically edited plants. And this, although is really not in the end product all that different, it's can be somewhat more targeted, and they're using genes that are already in the plant, but they're unmasking them and so on, so they can be they'll be more readily expressed. And nevertheless, for the organic sector, they cannot use genetically modified or edited seeds. Contamination is already a big problem for this sector, and now there's going to be no regulation and no mandatory transparency. And the recommendation was for this voluntary listing of new gene-edited seeds. And this is allegedly equivalent to breeding, but it's just sped up. So it's a very murky issue as far as I'm concerned, because I don't know how you can really claim the same kind of intellectual property, but we still have in spades this whole problem of organic farmers wanting to save locally adapted seeds, but having contamination. And this goes right back to Percy Schmeiser. And if you haven't watched the movie Percy, it's well worth watching. So at the same time, we have Agriculture Canada, different parts of the government consulting on sustainable agriculture. And they're saying, so when I looked at this, I said, well, what about organic agriculture? Because it's actually Canada's fastest growing agricultural sector. It's still not all that big, but it is established regenerative, sustainable farming practices that are codified. They're regulated federally. They're science-based expert consensus rules for ongoing improvement. And this federal strategy is completely missing the knowledge to achieve sustainable regenerative farming. When you look at the documents, on sustainable agriculture, if you search for organic, the only thing they talk about is organic matter in the soil. They don't talk about established practices. So what we concluded was that really you've got to focus on these healthy ecosystems. You've got to look at effects of wetlands, natural areas, the biodiversity, and the organic regenerative processes, and ambitiously reduce inputs, not only because of their effects and their unintended bad effects down the road, but because of their costs. And also, last December at the Convention of the Parties number 15 on biodiversity, right here in Montreal, Canada promised to reduce pesticides. The proposal was to be by 2/3. The final agreement was by half. And in Europe, they have said that they are going to have the toxic burden the numbers of products and the quantities of pesticides. So there's various metrics to how these pesticides are going to be reduced. And what we have to be doing is be shifting to best practices rather than allowing every pesticide that can limbo dance under some regulatory bar onto the market. We've got to be saying, okay, what are our best options, and using comparative assessments. And the PMRA and Agriculture Canada need to listen to, learn from, and support the organic experts because they're being shut out. Not completely, but they are. So the National Farmers Union is on the case, and they could not be more explicit in the need for ambitious transformation of agriculture. Agriculture has the potential
happened.
I would like to unmute. I'm getting very strange things on my screen. I'm almost finished. So the sources of problems are not going to solve them. So there, a promising possibility has been the proposal for a Canadian Farm Resiliency Agency, a bit like what was done during the 30s. To lead this climate adaptation, emissions reduction, and to actually put on the ground experts who will be able to create a network of demonstration farms. So in conclusion, the organic sector is really what ambition and success look like. So I have to thank you, and we'll move on to discussion.
Thank you very much, Meg. That was a very interesting presentation that you gave us, and quite wide-ranging, as you said it was going to be. So thank you very much for that. On deck, we have Jeff Passmore. He will be our first questioner. I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to tell you first, Jeff. And on deck after Jeff will be Samrat. He has had several questions that have been put through on the chat line. So Jeff, if you're still there, could you please unmute and make yourself available for a question?
Yes, I am unmuted. Thank you. And my question's pretty self-explanatory. Thanks very much, Meg, for your presentation. I enjoyed it, and certainly agree about the harm that pesticides and fertilizers have caused in terms of polluting our waters, including the oceans. But I have been told that there is not now and cannot be enough organic food to feed 8 billion people. So I'm just wondering about if you have any comments on that, and are there opportunities for bio-based pesticides and bio-based fertilizers?
Yes, well, thank you for that, Jeff. That's really important, and this is something that is it comes up time and time again. And I was at the organic conference at the end of January in Guelph, and we feature on our website actually a piece about Rick Green, who is an organic farming expert from the States. And he has been working on this in terms of very solid science-based, data-driven organic agriculture. And his yields are at least as much or exceed some of the regular, conventional, as it were, conventional these days, agricultural methods. And when we talk about this, we're looking at, the choice between moving to regenerative agriculture at speed, according to the National Farmers Union. That's not an organic sector. These are farmers wanting it to work. So that we've got to do major changes. When you talk about bio-based pesticides, basically, you're still talking about a product, but what the organic sector does is it rotates plants, it maintains the soil cover so that we do not need to have all of these fertilizers. We're using the nitrogen out of the air put into the soil by legumes for nitrogen. There may be some, a bit of minerals that have to be supplemented, but
so increasingly, you've like I used to live in Saskatchewan, and I have friends that farm 10,000 acres, which unbelievably is considered a medium-sized farm in Saskatchewan.
Yes, it is.
But yeah, but I mean, increasingly they're doing no-till agriculture, you know, which of course I think aligns in part with what you're talking about in regenerative agriculture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that, and also, you know, like that one example that I showed you where they had planted winter wheat, which, you know, it takes a fair bit of nitrogen to do winter wheat. You get a crop very first thing in the spring, and then he planted soy right into it. He didn't till it whatsoever. And the soy was putting the nitrogen back in. And then, you know, in the late season, you would plant something else. And this is in a climate zone that's very similar to Guelph. So this is the northern states.
Thanks for your comments.
Thank you, Jeff. Samrat, you're on, and Pierre Minou, you are on deck. Thank you.
Hi, Meg. Thanks for that amazing presentation. I have like a question which is not directly related to the pesticides thing, but it's because of your experience. Is like, is modern agriculture like in its current form a part of solutionism, that we can find a solution for everything via technology?
You know, farming is very, very diverse, but certainly we have large industries pushing that we just need more technology. We need a different modified seed. We need another kind of pesticide that will deal with plants that are already, or pests, maybe insects too, that are already resistant to yesterday's chemicals. But don't worry, we have something that's more expensive, more elaborate, more persistent, more toxic, whatever, less studied, that we will use today. Whereas organic has gone in the opposite direction. And now with the science and the scale up, they're proving that they can do that. And when you look at the crises that the tillage and so on has created, the changing climate, the desert, the, you know, increasing desertification, you know, rather than looking back to make a comparison, if we look into the future to see the trajectories that these various types of agriculture are on, we're kind of at a crossroads. And I think it's really, really important to be moving towards the more nature-based solutions, because our biodiversity crises, our soil crises, our climate crises require us to be moving towards a lot more no-till. And there's a lot of farmers who are recognizing this, and they don't have to be organic to be implementing a lot of these strategies. But if we do that in a really focused fashion, with, instead of having Monsanto out there telling the farmers what they should be doing, we have Government of Canada agrologists telling the farmers, you know, giving them good ideas, we'll have very different solutions.
Okay, thanks so much for your comment.
Thank you very much. So Pierre.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Meg. Gee, I don't know where to start. I had a lot of comments throughout. First of all, I'll start with the last thing I said, which is I'm actually more worried now that we're not adopting organic rules in Canada. Then we're throwing away IPM, lock, stock, and barrel. Just the use of treated seeds, which has climbed hugely, mean that every acre is treated, whether or not the pest is there and whether the chemical is needed. And it's, that to me is actually such a step backward, because we have 95% of the crop area being treated in some cases, except for Ontario and Quebec, where they've acted on it. And when you only need it for, you know, 10% of the area. So that's a comment, I mean, without even considering the pros and cons of organic agriculture. And I have mixed feelings about organic. But let me just get to another question or comment. Well, I have two. One was you talked about mycotoxins. As you know, I was involved in the regulatory side of pesticides for a long time. Whenever I pointed out to companies that their fungicides had some really interesting toxicological properties, usually fairly devious and long-term, they always said, well, yeah, but the alternative is higher levels of mycotoxins, and that's far worse. And indeed, the way we not only produce food, but the way we store food could generate huge concentrations of mycotoxins if we were not using the products that they are now selling. So that, in my mind, might actually be one of the more difficult ones to replace if we want to produce food on a very large scale and not have it contaminated by fungi.
Well, that's really interesting because way back, oh gosh, 20 years ago, when I was worried about the cosmetic use of pesticides, and we were debating that in Ontario, I spoke at in a lot of different places, and you got to know sort of what was coming. And so I was in this big hall, and in the question period, this fellow stands up, and he's older and he's got a plaid shirt, and I'm thinking, oh my goodness, he's going to tell me you can drink this stuff, it's so safe, and so on and so forth. And there was something about him. And so anyway, he started and he said, well, you got to pay attention, because these pesticides, they don't do us the kind of good that we're supposed, kind of that they're sold as. And he says that I kind of had a sense that perhaps something transformative had happened in his life. And he says, for years, I was a regular farmer, and then he decided to transition to organic. And he'd had problems with fusarium in his spelt, and he had problems with various fungal diseases. And he said that during the transition period, every single year, the fusarium went down in his crops until it was nothing. Like it wasn't being detected, because right now we're putting so much, the glyphosate and the other chemicals, what they're doing is they're destroying the microbiome. So there's nothing eating the fungi. And we've even got Canadian research showing that, and that's the anecdotal problem, that story is told time and time and time again, and it's even reported in the Western Producer that, it was a really bad year for fusarium again, but the organic sector isn't suffering this. So that's, it's something which is not showing up as a problem in the organic sector, but it's a really serious problem. And yeah, fungal diseases are dreadful. You've obviously got to be drying your grains properly and so on as well.
And may I sneak in my last one too while I've got the floor? Thanks.
Please do.
So on glyphosate, you didn't mention this, but my understanding that one of the main differences between IARC and regulatory agencies, whether here or in Europe, was that they put more emphasis, the regulatory agencies put more emphasis on studies where glyphosate active ingredient is being used in animal studies. And there's lots of evidence that without the normal adjuvants which come with glyphosate, without which glyphosate is actually not effective, that the material is not absorbed, whether it's by a plant or in the animal models that are being tested. So that a lot of the difference in the assessment has to do with consideration of studies where, in fact, the glyphosate was not well absorbed because it was in active ingredient form.
Yeah, that was put out there. It was kind of a trial balloon, but then when people actually got access to those regulatory studies, they realized that there were a lot of cancers that didn't get counted. The chap who used to be in charge of the ATSDR, actually, he was he was a witness for the people in California, but he's published reanalyses of these cancer studies where in the data, they had actually reported a lot more cancers than were actually counted by the regulators. So I'm sure that there's something to, obviously all those other ingredients are added for a reason, and it certainly makes a lot of sense. But then there's the other piece of it that the regulatory authorities, for some reason, they didn't consider, anal staining and so on as being adverse. And for some reason or another, they omit a lot of the observations, even in these studies that are put forward by the company.
On the active, yeah. But we do have a huge problem where all those studies are generated on the active ingredients. And toxicologically, the compounds are very different once they're released.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's one of many. That's definitely up there on the list of the many problems that and, it's not even just active ingredient plus all the adjuvants. You've got pesticides that are sprayed that have 3 active ingredients in them. And then, in an actual field, they'll spray fungicides one day and herbicide another day or whatever. So and then of course, sometimes it's actually on the seeds. So it's absolutely everywhere. But yeah, there's a lot of problems, and you can end up in a kind of unpredictable mess once you go down the rabbit hole of using a lot, very heavy input chemicals. Anecdotally, and with their results that are increasingly coming out, there are a lot of other ways. There are alternatives.
Thank you very much for that. Ted, you are up, and Anitra Thorleg, you are on deck.
I'm not sure if I'm going to eat anything today or drink anything, much less breathe the air. But yes, this is very alarming stuff, and of course has been for a while. Back many years ago, when I was head of land use research for Environment Canada, we had some successes working with Agriculture Canada in the fruit industry to try and get them to stop spraying every day and do a form of sort of very controlled integrated pest management. And the industry actually worked with us, as did Agriculture Canada and as did the farmers, because it cost them less money. And that definitely registered in their conscience. So coming back to this, my immediate inspiration from what you talked about is, yeah, we don't want to do this stuff, but do we have an alternative? Are we in fact getting the industry to work on something that will allow them to produce the amount they have to stay alive, but not poison us all while they're doing it?
Not very much, because Agriculture Canada is not focused on that. We're pretty heavily captured right now. That research, I'm showing you research from 15, 20 years ago, and we don't have that kind of research coming out anymore.
Okay. But the other countries, my second question a little later on, I'll throw it in right now because it sort of follows, is that a lot of other countries in Europe and Japan, as examples, are using the existing international conventions to block our stuff from going there, simply because we're using stuff that they will not sanction themselves. And so there are some international levers. I guess I'm wondering, can they be effective, and can we force our industry, our agriculture department, and our farmers to get on the bandwagon so that they still have access to other markets and to other substances?
Well, certainly, markets, you'd be crazy if that wasn't going to be a major driver. Farmers are farming because that's their living, and they have to pay for their food and survive. But certainly Canada is more lax in some ways, certainly than Europe. Europe has a different paradigm. We're very much in lockstep with the US EPA. Not 100%, but we tend to be laggards in this kind of thing. And there's actually there is a clause in the Pest Control Products Act saying that if something is completely banned in another country, then we have to look at it again. It doesn't say we shouldn't use it, but and sometimes it'll get looked at again, and it's kind of shrugged off as being no problem.
Thank you very much, Meg. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Meg. Thank you, Ted. Anitra, you are up, and John Legg, you're on deck.
Thank you for a most edifying talk, Meg. It was excellently done. And I'm going to take us to a slightly different place, because I've been working with the Club of Rome group on food with FAO and the European group on food. And of course, everybody's concerned about climate change affecting food security, which perhaps is the last thing that Canada about, because so much of the winter food is brought in from a series of various places. But there are many places it's brought in from, Peru being an example, where the glaciers are melting, and that's producing a lot of agriculture right now, but it will be over in a few years, and then the agriculture will be way down. Or for instance, the kind of protein and other products gotten from China, which come in terms of pharmaceuticals, dog food, and many other things. So the food security aspect of whether Canada should be food secure within themselves, or whether Canada should be food secure of all its sources of food that it imports, especially during the winter months, is a different question altogether. Now, some of this verges on the pesticides that places like Peru and Mexico, we know are coming in, despite their protestations that they're not coming in. But what is your feeling about the real food security once you come down to an organic kind of agriculture? Is that going to increase, decrease, make equitous, whatever, the food security of Canada's burgeoning population?
There's a continuum here. So at, the kind of after 5 years of transition and so on, you can become a certified organic farmer. But there are a lot of people, a lot of farmers who are using a lot of those practices. And those practices are what is going to improve our biodiversity, improve this carbon in the soil, keep the soil a little bit cooler, so that as the world warms, we won't simply be baking our crops in the fields. So whether it's certified organic, maybe that's not really what we should be aiming for at this stage, but we have to be putting those tools into the hands of the farmers and encouraging and demonstrating other ways to achieve their ends. Because for the last umpteen years, the only people who have been going out there and telling the farmers how to, the latest and greatest in farming is our chemicals. It's been cut way back in terms of independent agronomy in Canada, and that's what we're hoping to reinvigorate, and that's what the Farmers Union is saying is really needed. As far as internationally goes, I don't know. You listen to the news, and India is, weeks over 40 degrees. There's places where we've been getting food that are simply not, where people are starving. So we are really we're in a pickle. And so people are talking about a lot more greenhouses, putting greenhouses on the tops of buildings so that you've got the heat that's rising from the buildings going into the greenhouses, so you don't need nearly as much heat to, to keep the food, the crops warm. But certainly we do need to keep the vegetation on the ground. We need to make sure that we're looking after the wetlands and all of those basic ecological pieces for sustainability of ecosystems. And internationally, I don't want to try to call that, but I do think that Canada certainly has the capacity to be doing an awful lot more, for example, frozen vegetables and frozen fruits.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anitra and Meg. John, you are up, and Susan Tanner, you are on deck.
Thank you, Jean. Fascinating presentation, Meg. I was in foreign affairs for 31 years, so you'll recognize from this question that background. The question is there a growth in the number of international organizations which try to police poor agricultural practices in certain countries? And an illustration of that question is there have been increased political breakdowns of trade increasingly. What about health breakdowns of trade? Are there instances of that?
Oh gosh, I really don't know, and I'm not sure how you would detect that. Quite apart from, basically, starvation or lack of sustenance. But in terms of saying, oh, well, we've got this because of, this increase of disease because of a pesticide on a product from a certain country, as opposed to what's in Canada, particularly since Canada is really not the world leader in pesticide management, unless you listen to.
That's vis-a-vis Canada. The question is, the original question is perhaps too far out, and that is the question of organizations internationally. Are they organizing in a way which will not point the finger directly, but which will encourage countries with poorer records of agricultural practices? We individually, in the winter, we go in and to get vegetables. And if it comes from Mexico, you better wash it very, very well, or just not take certain vegetables which can't be washed, because Mexico does not have a very good record. And I'm not asking you to support my comment, but in terms of spraying with stuff that you don't want to be eating, there are times where I will get only Canadian because I have more faith in what I'll be eating. So I guess, there's a human policing, but what about international policing? Are there countries which are more strict, which have gotten together and say, hey, let us ban the international movement of vegetables and fruits if they contain such and such? So that's my question.
Okay. Well, the EU is much more stringent than Canada is in a lot of ways. And organic agriculture is, like, for instance, in Denmark, it's very, very, it's, a large proportion, a much larger proportion of the of what's being produced. But that kind of policing or that kind of organization would require a lot of analytical chemistry to back it up. And I don't know of that kind, that sort of resource allocation. And so, okay. I'm sorry. I wish I had a clearer answer.
Well, but it's a little far out.
Question. It's a great question.
But lead is now frowned upon in gasoline, and that is probably accepted internationally. So there's an example of, I don't know who does the regulation on that, but I'm just saying that if there are enough people who are objecting to what vegetables and fruit contain, that will find its way through to say, no, we're not accepting your products anymore. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, for instance, this chlorpyrifos that we were in court with Health Canada about and so on, that's been banned in the EU for years now.
Right.
And we've had Canadian commodities and Canadian foods turned around in Europe because they've tested them and said, no, you don't meet our standards, and it's very expensive. And organic, the organic certification has a whole different set of standards. So organic producers, they are having their things turned around, their commodities turned around, and that costs for various things that are beyond their control.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you, John. Meg. Susan, you are up, and John Hollins, you are on deck.
Great. Thank you so much, Meg. It's you did a wonderful job of marshaling all that science. And what worries me about it is that I see a pattern which relates to other areas of environmental issues that I have been working on. I'm vice chair of the Group of 78 and chair of their Environment Committee, and also vice chair of Ottawa Renewable Energy Co-op. And so what I've noticed is that we have a conceptual framework problem. Each of these problems is considered individual, and they all harm the environment, and they all have vested interests of current industries. And so the solutions that are provided are criticized incorrectly and are discounted and are not supported by federal government or any other subsidies. And so the solutions are all related to taking care of the environment, and they are not accepted. And I hope everybody that's listening to this and all of the CACR people will start to object, as John suggested, for all of these things, because we have a lot of objecting to do. We really have to be objecting on all sides, because we're fighting like Putin is, I guess, a fight on different sides. Whereas the real problem is, are we serious about survival? And the biggest problem, I think, is that the big rich people would rather be dead than poor. They are not interested in making a change to this. And so what bothers me is, do you see any hope in terms of how this might happen, that Agriculture Canada and Environment Canada might see the light? And are there ways that we could, as individuals and groups, support that, besides supporting the NFU? The reason we had a similar presentation to yours, not as beautifully scientific, but very much as about energy, was that we were worried about the climate change impacts. So what would you recommend to us? How can we support what you have recommended?
Well, that's a great question. And first of all, yes, I totally recognize this kind of systemic problems with trying to have make the changes that are needed. I think if we go back to what happened when Health Canada proposed having more glyphosate in some foods, people were actually shocked, and maybe it was just the luck of the time. It was a low news time or something. I don't know. But that issue, every once in a while, some issues take off, but you need to have people behind it who are really solidly science-based, because the first thing that will happen is that a whole bunch of false solutions will be put out as politically expedient. So you need to have a really strong science base there. And you need to have the truly independent voices, and you need to have truly expert technical voices. And, given that I'm basically working as a volunteer, and there are, literally billions of dollars going into expert voices telling us how, certain chemicals or certain processes, certain types of technologies to reduce carbon, whatever, are just the answer of the day. And if we miss the boat and miss this opportunity, then so you need that expertise, and it's a really tall hill to climb. So supporting the independent expertise is really important. And then just individuals talking to their MPs. Once people get it, you have to tell your MP what's important to you. They're there. They're supposed to be working for you. You're supposed to be the boss, and they're supposed to be making sure that things happen. So with our group, we present opportunities for people to write customized letters to their MPs, and we say, and then give them a call. Develop a relationship, because these are all individuals, and you can be absolutely certain that for instance, the chemical companies, all through the revisions of the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, there were chemical company people sitting in the room for every single meeting. But we don't have that capacity. So the vested interests are looking after their interests, but we don't have that same kind of capacity for the public interest, the Lorax, as it were.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that, Meg. It's nice to get a few ideas on what we can do to help this along. So thank you for that. John, to you, and we will follow up with the final question by Paul Beckwith, which is a little bit off topic for this particular presentation, but certainly in your area of expertise, Meg. So John, to you.
Thank you. And thank you, Meg, for being a volunteer in this domain. Great volunteering. You're describing another consequence of what Rubin calls a modern technological industrial society. Our governments, certainly in the Western world, have been and mainly still are driven by seeking economic growth, disregarding anything else that goes on. Now, this afternoon, you presented really two themes, pesticides and genetic modification. You spent most of your time on pesticides. Your questioners until me have not mentioned genetic modification. My question is, the compelling case in one area and the much more difficult case to establish as clearly as you have on pesticides. Have we, your audience, got our emphasis right by focusing entirely on pests?
Well, the genetic modification, there's lots of different ways that plants can be genetically modified. There were efforts to make golden rice that would have more vitamin A in it, for instance. But and this is supposed to, it never really panned out as being nutritionally significant, but nevertheless. So there are a few issues. First of all, a lot of the genetic modification has been targeted at making the crop plant resistant to pesticides. So, automatically you're paying a premium for seeds so that you can use particular chemicals that go along with them as a package. So they're not unrelated. But what we're seeing now is that genetically modified seeds are not allowed in organic agriculture, and those can be readily identified if you do the genome analysis. And then now what we're moving into is gene edited for whatever reason, and these seeds also cannot be used in organic agriculture, but there is no transparency, no labeling, no anything on these. So the organic sector is basically just being, you know, put in front of a firing line because they have no defense. There's no, they don't know what their neighbors are using, and it won't even be clearly labeled. There's no regulation whatsoever in Canada. And this was at the behest of CropLife that had the solution of a voluntary registry. But like, how on earth is an industry that's regulated supposed to be depending upon this voluntary thing? So I think that this kind of technology without the necessary constraints poses a very serious risk to organic agriculture. And you know, people can use various means and so on, but organic agriculture is actually defined and regulated, and there is, you know, it's a real thing that does have value added because of the, you know, very careful standards that are associated with it. But right now, the whole genome world is very murky, and I'm finding it very concerning because just because, well, basically biodiversity is really that's kind of the foundation upon which ecosystems are built. And for all of our seeds, for millennia, farmers have collected the best seeds. And so we've had, you know, development of varieties and so on. But now we're in a situation where farmers can't even save their best seeds because they might be contaminated genetically. And you can't see that on this. You can't look at a seed and say, oh yeah, this one, it's, you know, this one is genetically different. You can't tell that. So it's kind of undercutting not only the safety and the biodiversity, but it's also undercutting a very fundamental part of what I think agriculture should embrace, is the ability for locally adapted seeds to, you know, basically be saved and be part of the heritage and part of what we're going to be relying upon for food in decades to come. Oh,
thank you very much, Meg. That's great. Paul, I'm going to defer and ask you to wait for your question until after the end. I've had a chance to say thank you. We're over an hour and a half at this point. So if with your permission, this is what I decided to do. So Meg, thank you very, very much for a very enlightening talk that you've given us. It's certainly opened my eyes to areas that I knew a little bit about, but really didn't understand the complexities and the absurdities of some of the things that are going on. And so it was very interesting what you've presented. And so thank you very much for that.
Thank you very much to CHRC for the opportunity. I'm glad that I was able to express things clearly enough.
Excellent. So thank you for that. And with that, where are we here? Down here. For those of you who are still with us, again, thank you for attending this week's presentation of CHRC. And if you are interested in getting information about this particular talk or any of the others that we've had, you can please go onto our website, canadiancore.com, register for the Stay Informed section, and you will be given the links to this and other talks. I would also strongly recommend also to you, Meg, when you get the chat, that you take a look at some of the comments that were coming through the chat. It was really quite interesting and certainly flowed very closely from what had happened on your particular talk. So again, check our CanadianCore.com. If you're interested in finding out more about the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome, you certainly can find that on our website. If you're interested in becoming a member, you can certainly find that on our website as well. So again, thank you very much for attending, and I look forward to more comments and discussion afterwards. Thank you.